Like, that statement would be wild though. It would be absolutely wild. But at the same time, think about the number of gay men that would be enlisting into the US military. And then, if at any point in time they decide to come out, all they have to do so that the conservative people don't burn them on a stake is just say that they were affected by a gay bomb. Like, that would be so wild though.
The royal penis is clean, Your Highness.
Welcome to the Breakdown Podcast, where I talk about love, sex, and relationships from a guy's perspective, as well as a bunch of other guy shit. The man on the mic is a man who might find it hard to breathe if you've got that asthma. He is also a man who may include jumping to conclusions to his cardio routine. It is none other than your tall, dark, and mildly handsome man, Sir Denver B. And I'm back to doing the normal episodes. Yes, I am actually back. And just in case you didn't see the actual length of this episode, you'll know that this is actually a full-length episode. It's not one of the shorter ones. So if you weren't feeling those ones or you wanted longer length ones, then they're back. And I have come back, I have had a little bit of R&R. And I feel like I'm back like I never left. Like, it's actually a pretty good feeling to be back on the mic. And a bunch of things have been happening while I was away. Someone in the US got assassinated, or should I say shot. And, Nepal voted in a new prime minister via Discord. Which is wild as fuck though. Like, there's so many things that are happening. And a lot of them are on such a grand scale that I feel like I can't speak on something without making it sound grand. Which is why this episode is actually about strategy, or lack thereof. Or should I say not necessarily lack thereof, but rather just garbage strategy. And I will kind of get to why I speak on that in a little bit, because the entirety of this episode is just riddled with poor strategy calls. But then again, if I continue just saying it like that, it's gonna sound like it's very technical, and it's not. It's stuff that relates to real life. So if at any point you feel like, you might not necessarily be touched by the topic, it is something that relates to stuff that we as human beings do on a day-to-day. So hopefully you will listen all the way till the end, and should you like it, should you not like it, should you want to give a different sort of feedback, or should you want to suggest a potential topic, then you can hit me up via the social media links that are usually in the description below. They rarely ever change, and my DMs are always open, so I would be more than happy to get your feedback and handle it accordingly, because I love feedback. And while you're at it, a nice follow would be appreciated, because just like the other person that would want to get very, very many nice verifiable guests, having a good following is a pretty good place to start. But all in all, thank you so much for listening. And like I said, I hope you listen all the way till the end. And I should probably get the show on the road, because I do have a little bit to talk about here and there as far as strategy goes. And to kick things off, I will speak on where the term strategy may have originated from, which is the military, and how apparently there was a certain military of a certain country that proposed, and I kid you the hell not, this sounds absolutely unbelievable, a gay bomb. Yeah. Someone actually proposed it. It was actually a group of scientists that proposed it. And the funniest part about this entire thing is not just the proposal, but the fact that it was not only considered, but it was also funded for quite a bit of time. So I'm just gonna read the story before I get to tear it up, pun intended. So the story says, and I quote, "In 1994, the US Air Force's Wright Laboratory drafted a proposal for a non-lethal chemical weapon intended to impair enemy combat effectiveness in unconventional ways. Among the stranger concepts was a chemical agent that, when dispersed, could theoretically cause temporary same-sex attraction among enemy troops. The theory was that disrupting unit cohesion and focus by altering soldiers' sexual behavior could reduce their combat readiness without inflicting direct physical harm. This concept, nicknamed the gay bomb in later media coverage, was part of a larger set of proposals for the so-called quote-unquote harassment chemicals meant to incapacitate through embarrassment, distraction, or social disruption. The proposal appeared in a declassified set of documents obtained by the Sunshine Project via the Freedom of Information Act in the early 2000s. The materials revealed that the Air Force had budgeted $7.5 million over 6 years for the development of such non-lethal weapons. The gay bomb was not the only odd idea. Other suggestions included a bad breath chemical to produce halitosis among enemy personnel, an insect attractant to draw stinging insects towards targeted troops, and a chemical that would make enemy soldiers' skin extremely sensitive to sunlight. While many of these ideas never progressed beyond the concept stage, the documents confirmed that research funding was in fact allocated to exploring feasibility. Though the gay bomb was never developed nor deployed, its existence in official proposals highlighted the experimental mindset within certain Pentagon R&D sectors during the post-Cold War era. At the time, military planners were seeking non-lethal tools for peacekeeping, crowd control, and unconventional warfare. The disclosure of the concept decades later sparked controversy, ridicule, and debate about the ethics of weaponizing human behavior and sexuality. The case remains a striking example of how far military research can go when brainstorming psychological and social disruption as tools of war. End quote. Okay. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when I was reading about this, actually one of the first things that kind of cropped up after I read this article was, how the hell did they manage to do like a proposal or like a PowerPoint presentation of the entire thing? Because I'm trying to think about like these guys doing a full-on PowerPoint presentation and then having some cartoon of two men kissing or some image of two men kissing and saying, well, so this is one of the intended effects. Like, it would be so interesting just trying to pitch that to like the government or, you know, the armed forces. Like, there's a bunch of like starred generals and everything, because I'm assuming that's what happens in the US, you know, like those star generals will sit for those proposal meetings, and as these guys are busy listening to these guys asking for funding, they're like, all right, so this is what we intend on doing, you know, we want to make sure that as your fellow brothers can help you in times of war, they can also help you get some during times of war, and the best part about it is we intend on using that as a weapon. And now they have to start getting into an entire speech on how they intend on using a gay bomb. Because, like, at least this one was official. Imagine trying to push it out as an ad. You know, the US military, always having men's backs since time immemorial, are now moving forward to have men's backs as a form of punishment. Should you want to wage war against the US government, then they will respond accordingly by ensuring that you and your fellow men find new pleasures away from the US government. Because if the American government isn't screwing you, then it is your fellow brethren that are demonstrating against the US government that will resort to screwing you as well. As in, just think about it for a moment, because like these guys looked at it and they were like, the best way we can get these guys to be at their most vulnerable is if we make these guys resort to just being all gay and sexual with each other at war. Like, this is probably one of the wildest things that they probably came up with. Although granted, you know, the bad breath one I think would have probably worked pretty well. But that would probably only work if they just put it in their food, which I don't think would really work. So probably the insect attracting one probably would have more legs here. You know, pun intended, and also not intended really. Although back to the gay bomb thing, like these guys were thinking about it not just as a tool for war, but as a tool for crowd control. Like, do you think that to some degree it might have actually been used? Because you think about it, you know, not that I'm saying that it could have happened, but imagine a protest that happens at night, and then, you know, the anti-riot police are sent out, and, you know, they decide to disperse some gay bombs around the area, masquerading as tear gas or as smoke bombs. And then these two homies or a bunch of homies, you know, after they run away from like all the smoke, they get to an alley or a corner somewhere, and suddenly they look at each other and they're like, girl. And then the other one, girl. And then they all of a sudden start, you know, tearing each other up. And the wildest part about it is, like, if that happens in the evening and then they wake up the following morning and they're looking at each other, like, that would technically count as a one-night stand, which is wild. Like, you and your best friend had a one-night stand because you were fighting for your rights. Do you know how wild that shit sounds? And let's even make matters even worse, considering that the US government, or should I say the US military, tends to have some of its own mistakes. Imagine if the bomb accidentally goes off at the barracks. And especially, like, imagine if it's a bunch of those bombs that go off at the same time. Do you know some of those niggas might go full gay? Like, imagine the US government having to do a press statement because people's families have been broken because two niggas decided that they should join the army or some version of the military, and the wrong bomb went off, and now the US government has to justify it by saying that we had a minor incident that occurred in our barracks a few days ago during a training incident where an accident occurred and the bomb went off, and unfortunately due to that, a number of men's rectums have been destroyed, but fortunately they are receiving the care and treatment that they deserve. Our thoughts and prayers go out to the families that have suffered due to this incident occurring. We, however, urge them to remember that during these trying times where our wills, just like their backs, were tested, we as Americans do not give up on our people, and we continue to have strength and we continue to hope for their continued recovery. God bless our armed forces and God bless the United States of America. Like, that statement would be wild though. It would be absolutely wild. But at the same time, think about the number of gay men that would be enlisting into the US military, and then if at any point in time they decide to come out, all they have to do so that their conservative people don't burn them on a stake is just say that they were affected by a gay bomb. Like, that would be so wild though. But granted, at least we'd know that every American soldier would be having each other's back. But anyways, I think I've had my fun as far as making fun of this entire thing is concerned, so I am going to leave it at that and move it on to our main topic of this episode. Now, normally whenever you think of the idea of dating, whenever you think of the idea of meeting up with people, or even just banging, rarely do you ever think of it having some level of strategy. Like, even when you think about it short term, long term, medium term, like, at the end of the day, the whole thought of it just seems like it's something that people do. It's like an action, and maybe people might talk about it, but rarely will you ever hear people talking of dating requiring a strategy or dating having strategies. So when it comes to the point where people are speaking on it as a strategy, you know that people might get a little bit technical, but the interesting part about it is it's really about stuff that people do day to day. So when I stumbled across a particularly interesting dating strategy known as shrekking, I was quite interestingly surprised because it's not something that I hear people talk about all the time. Also, I've never really heard of it as a term per se, besides the fact that it was derived from the movie itself, which, was particularly profitable for the animators. But beyond that, the only thing that I could attribute it to is the fact that it might involve someone being ugly. But considering that this is something that seems to be taking shape for some people, or should I say some women are practicing some version of it, and it seems to be a dating strategy that women are taking up supposedly, I figured I might as well look into it. Now, I am going to play a clip that kind of speaks on it to a certain degree, then I can get into my thoughts on it, because I'm finding the thought of it particularly interesting, and not for the reasons that you might actually think it is. But either way, I'm going to let the clip play, then give my thoughts on it. So without further ado,
there's a new term for a very specific type of dating that's gaining popularity. Let's take a look. Well, shrekking involves dating someone you are not attracted to, maybe someone you think is below you, in hopes that they'll treat you better than other people have in your dating past. The term got its name because Princess Fiona took a chance on Shrek. However, unlike their happy ending in the movie, when you get shreked, it means the person that you lowered your standards for still ended up hurting you. As dating experts put it, in this, you're dating an ogre without the princess treatment.
Okay. Unfortunately, that kind of cut off, but the statement was princess treatment. So, just for those that didn't hear the full bit or didn't entirely understand, that's kind of what it was. But all in all, this is a very interesting piece of content. Like, this is just interesting in and of itself as a dating strategy. And I'm not gonna lie, like, the moment I listened to this, besides trying to understand why someone would resort to this, I just found it a little bit funny, because this is one of the many times that I am seeing an example of a dating strategy that women want to try and implement, which just looks very short term, but essentially is just based off of a large stack of bull. And you'd probably think that, by the time someone is coming up with this, they're probably giving it a bunch of thought and it's a smart idea. And considering that it is a dating strategy, at least some strategic thinking was implemented when this was being developed by whoever it is came up with it. But unfortunately, it doesn't seem like that much strategic thinking was put into this entire thing, at least in my opinion. Granted, when you look at a lot of the previous dating strategies that people have spoken about online that were being picked up and implemented by women, I don't think a lot of strategic thinking is being put into a lot of these quote-unquote dating strategies that a lot of women seem to be either picking up or choosing to resort to as some sort of a trend. Because you think about it, the whole don't go for broke men, go for guys with money, that trend not working too well for a lot of women. You look at the whole dating a nerd thing, also doesn't seem to be working particularly well for a lot of people. You look at the idea of dating a sapiosexual because, they're very intellectual people. There's still single nerds out here that aren't really getting it. And there's a lot of women that are complaining about narcissists and shit. You think of the idea of like the prayer services at the end or at the beginning of the year that women go for, where it's like, this is my year and I'm gonna get a man, still not working. You look at the idea of dating a guy in finance who's 6'5" with blue eyes, that doesn't seem to be working particularly well. You look at the whole idea of eating grapes under the table at the end of the year before midnight or round about midnight and shit, and that shit still hasn't been giving positive results. And you look at a bunch of this shit and honestly, like, you might even throw Shreking onto this list because it doesn't seem like it's helping all that well. And interestingly enough, there's a strategy that I heard which is very similar to this, or probably might have been the precursor to this, which has also not been netting women particularly great results overall. So essentially, like, you look at a bunch of these strategies and they just look like they're garbage. Like, they just seem like trend fads that are supposed to be short term, because I never really hear someone saying, oh, when I decided to go down with this trend when I was busy looking for a guy, I managed to secure my boyfriend and we've been together for the longest time. Like, I'm sorry, there's really no proof of concept on a bunch of these trendy strategies for dating that women seem to go for that just has good results. Like, personally, I don't think there's any that's had any positive results. And the reason why I think this whole Shreking strategy is going to be thrown into that pile as well is because, one, they're mostly short term. Because, okay, maybe it might work long term for a few women, but for the most part, it'll be short term for a lot of them. And once they realize that it's not about the guy being uglier that'll really affect the quality of the relationship, then they'll probably drop it. Also, there's the part about them going to try it out with an uglier dude, then they realize that there's really not much of a difference because, regardless of whether the guy knows or doesn't know that they're ugly, they'll just treat you the same way as they'd probably treat every other woman, provided that they're particularly confident. Which also goes back to the fact that people forget that you can't just switch up your desires overnight or, with a flip of a switch. So yes, she might go on a couple of dates with a few ugly dudes, maybe try dating one or two, but eventually she'll still go back to the idea of the fine dude that she's had for the longest time. Not unless if it's, some toxic example that she has to automatically switch over time for the sake of maturity and possibly long-term health and shit. So essentially, like, this as a strategy is just short-term at best. And when you kind of look at it, even when it comes down to it, as far as these trendy strategies go, most women are kind of doing them wrong. Because, like, if you were to go and, for example, let's say, y'all are going to look for the nerds out here, you guys would look for a good-looking nerd. Like, a good-looking nerd that's well-spoken and very confident is going to behave radically different from a not-so-good-looking or a not-so-well-dressed or an underconfident nerd that probably might be a great partner. And guess what? The good-looking, super confident nerd will probably be able to juggle you and a bunch of other babes. Now, I'm not saying that that's all of them, but if the guy chose to be a player, he can probably be a player. And he will use this dating trend to bag a bunch of y'all, and y'all won't be able to do shit about it. You'll just come back and complain, these nerds, they're players nowadays and they treat us like shit, blah blah. Which is the same exact thing that's happening with Shreking. It's kind of the same way, the trend that kind of came before Shreking was the whole, don't go for the great looking guys, go for the medium ugly. And it's like, the guy is good looking enough that he isn't considered ugly, but he's not great looking that a bunch of women would swarm around the guy. And then suddenly you realize that most of these guys, the moment they get the confidence and they suddenly realize that they can pull a bunch of babes, some of them just choose to be players and they end up not treating you all that great. Which, in this particular case, where you have very ugly dudes, supposedly, y'all were getting Shrek'd since day one. Like, some of y'all just didn't understand that that's not a good way to look for a guy. And the truth of it is, like, when you kind of look at these trendy dating strategies that women seem to be told about on IG or on TikTok or some other place, you realize that they basically try to generalize and show that, oh, you know, this might be able to net you better guys or more guys, or a guy that is obsessed with you or wants to be with you, but forgets to understand that just like other trendy fads, the issues that all of them were having that made them all garbage is basically the same. And that's usually the fact that y'all seem to be judging men by looks or by certain, existing character traits to determine compatibility, which is completely off. Like, when you kind of look at it, like when you're busy saying look for a guy in finance, 6'5", blue eyes, much as that was more for like, an interesting song and shit, you realize that women are judging more by looks now than they probably should. When you look at the idea of going for something like shrekking or going to look for a medium ugly guy, they're judging by looks and they probably shouldn't. When they're looking at dating guys that have money, they're judging them by the look that they have money, not by the characteristics. At the end of the day, it's just not going to work. And yes, I probably should have said this at the beginning. I'm not saying that every woman does this. I'm just saying that there's some who do, and it's not been producing particularly great results. Just figured I should give that also as well. But I feel like at the end of the day, instead of looking for some of those visual appeals, I think it's better to just look for character traits and triggers instead, as opposed to looking for something that could visually tell you that this is going to be a great guy to date. Because I have seen good looking guys who are players, I have seen ugly dudes who are players, I have seen fat guys, I have seen skinny guys, I have seen guys with money, and I have seen broke guys all be players, and I have seen loyal versions of them as well. And on either of those camps, they have been that in numbers. So you can't really say that either one of those is going to be a good determinant of a good partner. All you can hope for is that whichever one you bag, should you be interested in one or the other, is going to be a good partner. All right. And this is me trying to help women out here, because it seems like y'all seem to be generalizing a lot. It's kind of like the way y'all used to complain that guys generalize women all the time, and apparently just because you go to the club or just because you might have had a thing with one or two different guys, it doesn't make you a hoe or some shit, or just because you ask for money you're not a gold digger. But at the end of the day, like, y'all have been doing the same thing when it comes to this whole generalization of what makes a good partner. And the truth of it is, you really can't say for certain if you're generalizing. You're going to have to be a little bit more specific. So maybe, just maybe, looking for character traits and triggers that would show that this is a good example of a good partner, or should I say a combination of values and character traits, would probably work a hell of a lot better than you choosing to look for the ugly dude or the good looking dude. Because at the end of the day, whether you want to talk about red flags or green flags, if you're just paying attention to some of the things that are very, very short term or are very, very misleading as singular traits, then of course you're going to be misled. Of course you're going to give up a good dude for someone that might not be all that great, or you might just give up a good dude simply because you're looking at things all wrong. Sometimes you have to look for a combination of things and not just singular traits to remove, as you're busy saying, you know what, I want to find the man of my dreams, I want to find a man that's obsessed with me. Like, focus on getting yourself a great dude first before you can look for someone that's obsessed with you, in my opinion. That's just what I think. And in line with that, I'm gonna say something very controversial, but maybe saying yes to every single date request and actually going on those dates, not sleeping with a guy, but just going on those dates, with a couple of different guys and listening to them and experiencing how some of them behave, act, and think and so on will probably net you a long-term dude a lot faster or a lot better than the idea of you going out and Shrekking. Because at the end of the day, at least you're using the law of averages, which is mostly close to a foolproof method, as a means of you bagging a dude, which probably will work a hell of a lot better than you choosing to go for some version of medium ugly or you going and Shrekking and then you end up being Shreked. Which kind of leads me to the conclusion to all of this, which is Shrekking is a shit strategy. That's essentially what I've been trying to say the entire time, for like the last maybe 12-13 minutes or some shit. Shrekking is a shit strategy, alright? If you really want a good strategy, look at the values and characteristics that you'd want in your future man, see if you can live up to some of those characteristics, and then you can try and build the aesthetics after that, such that it doesn't bother you as much whether you'll be Shrekking or getting Shreked or not. Although, then again, maybe I could be catching a feeling because Mr. Tall, Dark, and Mildly Handsome might be, getting pushed out of the market because of Shrekking, or maybe there's an upside to this that I'm not seeing yet that you might have spotted. Either way, I want your thoughts on it. The DMs are open. On IG, it is at the Breaktime_podcast. On Facebook, it is at the Breaktime Podcast. On X, it is at BagakaTheD. And on Bluesky, it is at the BreaktimePod.bsky.social. Thank you so much for listening all the way till the end, and I will catch you guys on the next break.
But what I believe is that if you put a pastor and a prostitute in one room, one is likely to convert the other.